The morning of October 25, 1944, dawned with deceptive quiet off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston, watching colored geysers erupt from the ocean as Japanese shells splashed around his ship. Red, yellow, and green dye markers transformed the Pacific into a deadly kaleidoscope. 7 miles behind him, 6 escort carriers, the vulnerable baby flat-tops of Taffy 3, fled south at their maximum speed of 17 knots. 7 miles ahead, bearing down with mathematical certainty, steamed the most powerful surface force the Imperial Japanese Navy could muster. 4 battleships, including the 72,000-ton Yamato with her 18-inch guns, 7 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Evans had already been wounded. 2 of his fingers were blown off when an 18-inch shell from Yamato had obliterated Johnston's bridge moments earlier. His shirt was gone, torn from his body by the blast. Most of his command staff lay dead around him. His ship was crippled, down to 1 engine, barely capable of 17 knots. She had already expended all 10 of her torpedoes in a suicidal charge that had blown the bow clean off the heavy cruiser Kumano. By every tactical calculation, by every rational assessment of the situation, Johnston should have been retreating to the relative safety of the smoke screen that shrouded the fleeing carriers. Instead, Evans did something that defied all logic. He ordered his crippled destroyer to turn around and charge back into the teeth of the Japanese battle line. The decision seemed insane. It was also about to help win one of the most lopsided naval victories in military history. This is the story of how American destroyer crews abandoned every rule of prudent naval warfare, launched themselves at 35 knots directly into overwhelming enemy firepower, and discovered that in certain desperate circumstances, the most reckless tactics become the only rational choice. The tactical doctrine that Evans was violating had been written in blood over decades of naval warfare. Destroyers were never supposed to attack battleships. The mathematics of such an encounter appeared conclusive. A Fletcher-class destroyer like Johnston displaced 2,500 tons. She carried 5 5-inch guns with a maximum effective range of 10 miles, though accurate fire was difficult beyond 7. Her armor consisted of thin plating designed to protect against shell splinters and machine gun fire, nothing more. Her crew called her a tin can for good reason. A single hit from a heavy caliber shell would punch through her hull as easily as a rifle bullet through cardboard. Against this fragility stood ships like Yamato, 72,800 tons of displacement, armor belts 16 inches thick, designed to withstand hits from the heaviest naval guns in existence. 9 18-inch guns that fired shells weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 25 miles. Each of Yamato's main battery shells weighed more than an entire Fletcher-class 5-inch gun mount. The battleship Nagato added 16-inch guns to the Japanese firepower. The heavy cruisers brought 8-inch batteries capable of firing 1,400-pound shells. Any one of these vessels possessed sufficient firepower to obliterate a destroyer in minutes. The standard destroyer torpedo attack doctrine reflected this disparity. Destroyers approached under cover of darkness or smoke, closed to within 5,000 yards if possible, fired their torpedo spreads, then retreated at maximum speed before enemy fire could find them. The torpedoes themselves provided the killing power. The Mark 15 torpedo carried an 825-pound warhead that could cripple or sink even a battleship if it struck below the waterline. But these weapons had severe limitations. Maximum effective range was 5 miles. Beyond that distance, targets had too much time to detect the torpedo wakes and take evasive action. The torpedoes traveled at 45 knots, fast enough to catch most targets, but slow enough that alert lookouts could spot their wakes in daylight. The attack window remained narrow. A destroyer had to close to within 5,000 yards, expose itself to devastating return fire during the run-in, launch its torpedoes, then escape before enemy shells destroyed it. Even under ideal conditions, with surprise and coordination, such attacks carried enormous risk. Naval planners had calculated acceptable loss rates. In a major fleet action, destroyer squadrons might expect to lose 30 to 40% of their ships in successful torpedo attacks. Those losses were considered acceptable if the destroyers succeeded in crippling enemy capital ships, disrupting enemy formations, or buying time for friendly forces to maneuver. But the morning of October 25, 1944, presented circumstances that bore no resemblance to any scenario in the tactical manuals. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. His force had been providing air support for the American invasion of Leyte Gulf when Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait at 6:45 that morning. The appearance of the Japanese fleet should have been impossible. Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet was supposed to be guarding that strait. Instead, Halsey had taken his fleet carriers and fast battleships north in pursuit of Japanese carriers that were serving as a decoy. The northern force had successfully drawn away the only American ships capable of standing against Kurita's battleships. Sprague found himself in a nightmare scenario. His 6 escort carriers could not outrun Kurita's battleships. The Japanese cruisers alone could make 35 knots. His carriers topped out at 17. The carriers had launched all available aircraft at the first sighting, but the planes had been armed for ground support missions, not ship attacks. Some carried depth charges, others carried nothing but propaganda leaflets. Only a handful had the armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes necessary to seriously damage heavily armored warships. His screening force consisted of 3 destroyers Johnston, Howell, and Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, even smaller ships with just 2 5-inch guns each. Against Kurita's 23 warships, this represented the most extreme mismatch in naval combat history. The tactical situation offered Sprague exactly one advantage. Rain squalls moving through the area provided intermittent cover. If his carriers could reach those squalls and generate enough smoke, they might buy time for Halsey to return or for 7th Fleet battleships engaged to the south to come to their rescue. But reaching those squalls required time, and time required that something slow the Japanese advance. Sprague made a decision that naval historians would debate for decades. At 7:06, he ordered his destroyers to attack, not to lay smoke and screen the carriers, not to conduct a defensive torpedo attack from medium range. He ordered them to charge directly into the enemy fleet and engage with everything they had. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans needed no second invitation. Born August 13, 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma, Evans was a Cherokee Indian who had served in the Oklahoma National Guard before enlisting in the Navy in 1926. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1931, earning the nickname Chief that would follow him throughout his career. At his commissioning ceremony for Johnston back in October 1943, Evans had made a declaration that his crew would remember, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now Evans had his chance to make good on that promise. Even before receiving Sprague's formal order, Johnston had broken formation. At 7:04, while other ships were still laying smoke, Evans had ordered flank speed and turned toward the enemy. The destroyer surged forward, her 2 Curtiss turbines driving her to 35 knots. Her bow lifted as she accelerated, throwing spray high into the air. Behind her, a 2,500-yard trail of black smoke marked her passage. Evans had identified his target. The heavy cruiser Kumano led the Japanese cruiser column, steaming at 35 knots to outflank the fleeing American carriers. If Kumano and her sisters reached firing position, they would systematically destroy the escort carriers one by one. Evans intended to stop her. Johnston zigzagged between shell splashes as she closed the range. Japanese gunners had spotted her immediately. The destroyer represented an easier target than the carriers, and multiple Japanese ships shifted their fire to engage. Colored splashes bracketed Johnston as Japanese ships used dyed shells to spot their fall. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Evans had calculated correctly. At maximum speed, changing course every 30 seconds, Johnston presented a nearly impossible target for long-range gunnery. The Japanese fire control systems had been designed for longer-range engagements against slower-moving capital ships. They could not adjust rapidly enough to track a destroyer, making radical course changes at 35 knots. At 7,000 yards, less than 4 miles, Johnston opened fire with her 5 5-inch guns. Her Mark 37 fire control radar had locked onto Kumano. The radar-assisted fire control system that American destroyers carried represented a technological advantage that Japanese ships lacked. Johnston's guns fired in rapid succession, pumping 15 rounds per minute from each barrel. 75 shells per minute poured toward Kumano as Johnston continued closing the range. The American shells, far too light to penetrate the cruiser's armor belt, nevertheless wreaked havoc on her superstructure. They destroyed fire control systems, killed exposed crew members, started fires, and most critically, distracted Kumano's attention from the carriers. At 10,000 yards, Evans had given the order his crew had been waiting for. Fire torpedoes! Johnston's 2 quintuple torpedo mounts swiveled to port. The Mark 15 torpedoes, each 21 feet long and weighing 3,000 pounds, slid from their tubes at 3-second intervals. 10 torpedoes entered the water, their propellers immediately engaging as their turbine engines spun up to 45 knots. The weapons fanned out in a spread pattern calculated to hit a moving target even if it attempted evasive maneuvers. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. Officers on Johnston's fantail heard the sounds they had been trained to recognize. Muffled underwater explosions, 2 or possibly 3 of them, marking successful detonations against Kumano's hull. The heavy cruiser emerged from the resulting smoke and spray with her stern section burning furiously. 1 torpedo, perhaps 2, had struck her bow, blowing the forward section clean off. Kumano slewed to starboard, her speed dropping to 12 knots as flooding compartments threatened to drag her bow under. She would take no further part in the battle. The Japanese cruiser Suzuya stopped to take off Kumano's commanding officer, and while stationary became vulnerable to American air attacks. A near miss bent one of Suzuya's propeller shafts, reducing her to 22 knots and effectively removing her from the action as well. Johnston had knocked 2 Japanese heavy cruisers out of the battle with a single torpedo spread, but she had also attracted every enemy ship's attention. At 7:20, as Johnston reversed course and tried to retreat behind her own smokescreen, Yamato's fire control officers achieved a firing solution. The battleship's massive 18-inch guns, designed to hit targets at 25 miles, trained down to nearly point-blank range. 3 shells from Yamato's forward turret bracketed Johnston. 1 18-inch armor-piercing shell, 3,200 pounds of hardened steel moving at 2,500 feet per second, struck Johnston just forward of her bridge. The impact obliterated everything in its path. The shell punched through Johnston's thin hull plating without slowing, passing completely through the ship before detonating underwater off the port side. The pressure wave from the underwater explosion flexed Johnston's hull, buckling plates and rupturing seams. Fragments from the explosion shredded the bridge, killing most of Evans's command staff and wounding Evans himself. 2 more shells, these from Yamato's 6-inch secondary battery, struck forward and amidships. 1 destroyed Johnston's forward fire control director. Another penetrated to the engine rooms, destroying number 1 engine room and the adjacent generator room. Johnston's speed dropped from 35 knots to 17. Her forward guns fell silent as power failed. She developed a 10-degree list to port as the engine room flooded. By all reasonable expectations, Johnston was finished. Any prudent commanding officer would have ordered his crew to abandon ship immediately. The destroyer was clearly dying. Her magazines were exposed. 1 more hit could detonate her ammunition and blow her in half. Evans looked at the Japanese fleet still bearing down on the carriers. He looked at his surviving crew members. He made a decision that violated every principle of self-preservation and tactical preservation of force. All guns, local control. All guns that can, open fire. While Johnston fought for survival, the other 2 destroyers of Taffy 3's screen were executing their own desperate attacks. Commander Amos Hathaway's USS Heermann had missed the initial order to attack. Communications in the smoke and confusion of battle were chaotic at best. When Heermann finally received the order at 7:50, she was on the far side of the carrier formation. Hathaway immediately ordered flank speed and turned toward the enemy. What followed was a masterclass in ship handling under impossible circumstances. Heermann had to transit through the carrier formation, while those carriers were making radical evasive maneuvers in heavy smoke and intermittent rain squalls. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. The destroyer nearly collided with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Hathaway ordered engines reversed full, and Heermann's stern dropped as her screws bit in reverse thrust. She missed Roberts by less than 10 feet. Straightening course, Heermann accelerated toward the enemy formation. Then she nearly struck the destroyer Hoel, also making her attack run. Again, Hathaway ordered emergency reverse. Again, Heermann's hull shuddered as she fought to avoid collision. She missed Hoel with barely 20 yards to spare. Having navigated through friendly ships without collision, Heermann now faced the Japanese fleet. Hathaway identified his first target. The heavy cruiser Haguro, leading the cruiser column at 35 knots, was closing to firing range on the carriers. Heermann opened fire with her 5-inch guns, engaging in what would become one of the most unusual gunnery duels in naval history. A 2,500-ton destroyer was exchanging fire with a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns. Heermann closed to point-blank range. At 5,000 yards, she fired 7 of her 10 torpedoes at Haguro. The torpedoes missed, but their presence in the water forced Haguro to turn away, breaking her attack run on the carriers. More importantly, the torpedoes' wakes heading toward the battleship column beyond Haguro caused panic in the Japanese formation. Heermann's remaining 3 torpedoes were targeted at the battleship Haruna. Hathaway brought his destroyer to within 4,400 yards less than 2.5 miles before launching. At that range, the torpedoes would reach their target in less than 4 minutes. Japanese gunners aboard multiple ships concentrated fire on the audacious destroyer that had penetrated so deep into their formation. 8-inch shells from Chikuma, the leading cruiser, began hitting Heermann. The shells were high-explosive rounds designed for use against unarmored targets. Against Heermann's thin plating, they were devastatingly effective. One hit flooded compartments forward, causing the bow to drop so low that Heermann's anchor chains began dragging in the water. Another shell disabled one of her 5-inch mounts. But the remaining guns continued firing, and Heermann began engaging the battleship column itself. At approximately the same time, torpedoes from Hoel also entered the water near the battleships. The exact sequence of events became confused in the chaos of battle, but the result was clear. Yamato and Nagato, detecting torpedo wakes approaching from multiple directions, turned sharply to port to comb the tracks. The evasive maneuvers took both battleships out of the action for 20 minutes. Most significantly, the turn took Admiral Kurita himself out of effective command. Yamato's communications equipment meant Kurita could only communicate with his fleet, while his flagship maintained course and speed. The evasive maneuvers disrupted his ability to coordinate the attack. Individual Japanese ship commanders found themselves fighting independently, without central direction or coordination. What should have been a coordinated fleet action dissolved into a confused melee. The destroyer Hoel, under Commander William Dow Thomas, had led the initial attack at 7:16. Her run demonstrated why destroyer torpedo attacks were considered near-suicidal missions. Hoel had targeted the battleship Congo at 18,000 yards 9 miles. She opened fire as she closed the range, her 5-inch guns engaging Congo's secondary batteries. At 14,000 yards, Congo's 14-inch main guns found the range. A 14-inch shell struck Hoel below the bridge, destroying her forward engine room and main generator. The destroyer lost half her power and developed a 10-degree list to port, but Thomas kept coming. At 10,000 yards, Hoel had closed enough to launch her first 5 torpedoes at Congo. She then swung to target the heavy cruiser Haguro with her remaining 5 torpedoes. Japanese fire intensified. Hoel found herself boxed in by battleships and cruisers firing from multiple directions. A 16-inch shell from Nagato struck amidships, destroying another engine room. Hoel's speed dropped to 0. She could no longer maneuver. Dead in the water, listing heavily, her forward sections on fire. Hoel became a stationary target for Japanese gunnery practice. But even immobile and dying, Hoel continued fighting. Her afterguns, still operational under local control, continued engaging enemy cruisers. For another hour, as Japanese shells systematically destroyed her, Hoel's survivors kept their remaining weapons in action. Not until 8:55, after taking over 40 hits from guns ranging from 5-inch to 16-inch caliber, did Hoel finally capsize and sink. Of her 339-man crew, only 86 survived. The destroyer escorts, even smaller and more lightly armed than the destroyers, also charged into the battle. Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., displaced only 1,700 tons and mounted just 2 5-inch guns. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, positioned his ship to engage the heavy cruiser Chikuma. The resulting gun duel defied all logic. Sammy B. closed to such short range that Chikuma's 8-inch guns could not depress low enough to hit her. The American destroyer escort fired over 600 rounds in 35 minutes, scoring multiple hits on the vastly larger cruiser. When Chikuma finally landed hits with her secondary battery, the damage was catastrophic. 8-inch shells penetrated Sammy B's thin hull and detonated inside her machinery spaces. But even crippled, Sammy B's crew fought on. They fired their 3 torpedoes at point-blank range, claiming 1 hit on Chikuma's stern. They continued firing their 5-inch guns until ammunition ran out. Only when the ship was clearly sinking, her engineering spaces flooded, and her list exceeding 45 degrees, did Copeland give the order to abandon ship. The American destroyer and destroyer escort attacks transformed what should have been a one-sided massacre into a confused, desperate struggle. The Japanese formation, which had begun the engagement in organized columns optimized for concentrated firepower, had dispersed across miles of ocean. Individual ships maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes. Communications between Japanese vessels broke down in the smoke and confusion. Most critically, the Japanese commanders developed a profoundly incorrect assessment of what they were facing. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato as American destroyers charged his battleships at suicidal close range, reached an alarming conclusion. These could not be mere destroyer escorts screening escort carriers. No commander would sacrifice destroyers so recklessly unless protecting something of immense value. Kurita convinced himself he must be facing a major American task force. The carriers fleeing south must be fleet carriers, the Essex-class carriers he had been seeking. The destroyers attacking so aggressively must be the screen for those fleet carriers. More American capital ships must be nearby, perhaps. Halsey's fast battleships approaching from the north. This assessment, though completely wrong, was understandable. American naval doctrine emphasized preservation of force. Destroyers were valuable assets not to be thrown away carelessly. The Japanese commanders knew this. They had studied American tactics extensively. What they were witnessing violated everything they understood about American naval doctrine. Therefore, their assumptions about the American force composition must be incorrect. The Americans must have heavy units nearby. The aggressive destroyer attacks must be buying time for those heavy units to engage. Japanese after-action reports reflect this confusion. The cruiser Tone reported engaging an American heavy cruiser, actually the destroyer Johnston, whose 5-inch guns were firing so rapidly that Japanese observers mistakenly identified her as a larger ship. The cruiser Haguro reported torpedoes from multiple directions, suggesting she faced at least a full destroyer squadron rather than 3 ships. Kurita's flagship log entries note concern about American battleships potentially approaching from the east. Reality contradicted Kurita's assessment at every point. Taffy 3 consisted of precisely what it appeared to be 6 escort carriers and their minimal screen. No fleet carriers, no battleships, no heavy cruisers. Just the vessels Kurita's lookouts could see, plus the suicidal courage of men who knew they were already dead but intended to make that death count. But perception, not reality, drives command decisions in the chaos of combat. Kurita's flawed assessment led him to issue orders based on an incorrect understanding of the tactical situation. Instead of maintaining formation and systematically destroying the escort carriers, he ordered general attack. Each ship commander was to engage independently. This decision fragmented Japanese firepower. Ships that should have been concentrating their guns on the defenseless carriers instead chased after destroyers that dodged between smoke screens and rain squalls. The heavy cruisers, whose 35-knot speed should have allowed them to run down the 17-knot carriers, instead found themselves engaged in gunnery duels with American destroyers and destroyer escorts. The battleships, whose massive guns could have destroyed the carriers from beyond effective aircraft range, were forced to maneuver evasively to avoid torpedo attacks. Meanwhile, the escort carrier pilots achieved results far beyond their equipment's capabilities. Planes armed with depth charges attacked Japanese cruisers, scoring near misses that damaged propellers and rudders. Aircraft carrying nothing but leaflets made fake torpedo runs, forcing Japanese ships to take evasive action. Planes that had expended their weapons made strafing runs with machine guns, killing exposed anti-aircraft crews and forcing Japanese gunners to take cover. The continuous air attacks from multiple directions prevented Japanese ships from focusing effectively on any single target. The escort carrier Gambier Bay represented the tragic vulnerability of the American force. Unable to outrun the pursuing Japanese ships, she became the focus of concentrated fire from multiple cruisers and from Yamato herself. 18-inch shells began landing around her at 8:20. By 9:07, Gambier Bay had taken so many hits that she capsized and sank. She would be the only American carrier sunk by enemy surface gunfire during the entire war. But her sacrifice bought time. While Japanese ships concentrated on destroying Gambier Bay, the other 5 carriers continued fleeing south. American aircraft continued launching from their decks, adding to the swarms already attacking the Japanese formation. The crippled Johnston, still afloat despite catastrophic damage, continued fighting. With only one engine operational, down to 17 knots, her bow damaged and her forward sections flooding, Evans brought his destroyer back into action. When Sprague ordered destroyers to make a second torpedo attack, Evans responded even though Johnston had already expended all her torpedoes. "We'll go in with the destroyers and provide fire support," he announced. Johnston limped forward, firing her remaining operational 5-inch guns at any Japanese ship that came within range. At 8:20, Johnston emerged from a smoke screen to find herself less than 7,000 yards from the battleship Congo. Despite having no torpedoes left, despite her damage, Johnston opened fire. Her guns pumped shells at Congo for several minutes before Japanese return fire forced her back into the smoke. Then Johnston spotted a squadron of 7 Japanese destroyers attempting to launch a coordinated torpedo attack on the carriers. Evans turned toward them, presenting Johnston's full broadside against the Japanese destroyers' bow guns. This classic crossing the T maneuver gave Johnston a devastating advantage. Her 5 guns could fire, while the Japanese destroyers, approaching bow-on, could only bring their forward mounts to bear. Johnston's concentrated fire forced the entire Japanese destroyer squadron to turn away. They would eventually launch their torpedoes, but from much longer range and in a dispersed pattern that American pilots could strafe from the air. Not a single Japanese destroyer torpedo found its target. By 9 o'clock, Johnston had absorbed so much damage that she could no longer maneuver effectively. Congo's 14-inch shells had knocked out her remaining engine. Multiple fires burned throughout the ship. Her forward sections were completely flooded. Evans gave the order to abandon ship, then was never seen again. Japanese destroyers passing the sinking Johnston rendered honors, their crews coming on deck to salute as American sailors floated in the water. Johnston sank at 9:40. Of her 327-man crew, 145 survived. Commander Ernest Evans would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation noting he had consistently interposed his vessel between the hostile fleet units and our carriers. No higher praise could be given to a destroyer captain. At 9:23, after 2.5 hours of chaotic engagement, with his fleet dispersed across miles of ocean, with reports of American aircraft and torpedoes coming from every direction, with his assessment that he faced a major American task force, seemingly confirmed by the desperate resistance he encountered, Vice Admiral Kurita made a decision that would be debated for the rest of his life. He ordered a general retreat. The order made no tactical sense if Kurita had accurately understood the situation. His fleet still vastly outgunned Taffy 3. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers, but retained 4 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers more than capable of destroying the remaining 5 escort carriers. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts that had caused such havoc were sinking or had already sunk. The path to Leyte Gulf and the undefended American transports lay open, but Kurita operated on his flawed assessment of facing a major task force with heavy units nearby. Continuing the engagement risked losing his entire fleet to what he believed were superior American forces. Preservation of the fleet for future operations seemed more important than pursuing what might be a tactical trap. The Japanese formation turned northwest and withdrew through San Bernardino Strait. Taffy 3, battered and bloodied, had survived. 4 American ships lay at the bottom, the destroyers Johnston and Howell, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The 3 surviving destroyers and remaining destroyer escorts were heavily damaged. Over 1,000 American sailors had died, but the escort carriers had been saved. The invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf remained untouched. The Japanese surface fleet retreated, without accomplishing its mission. The Battle off Samar would be remembered as one of the greatest last stands in naval history. The lesson learned by American naval commanders from Samar appeared straightforward. Aggressive destroyer tactics, even against overwhelming odds, could achieve decisive results through a combination of psychological impact and tactical disruption. Japanese commanders, psychologically conditioned to expect careful American husbanding of forces, reacted with confusion and caution when faced with reckless aggression. The continuous threat of torpedo attacks forced larger ships to maneuver defensively rather than focus on offensive action. Combined with effective air attacks, even small surface forces could achieve results far beyond what their tonnage and firepower suggested. But the Taffy 3 experience represented a unique convergence of circumstances. The Japanese had entered the engagement with flawed intelligence and made critical command decisions based on incorrect assumptions. The rain squalls and smoke screens had provided cover that would not always be available. The escort carrier aircraft, despite their inadequate armament, had maintained continuous pressure on Japanese ships. Most critically, American destroyer captains like Evans, Thomas, and Hathaway had demonstrated tactical brilliance and courage that could not be assumed for every commander. The question remained, could destroyer torpedo tactics succeed against battleships under different circumstances, with both sides possessing accurate intelligence and making rational command decisions? 6 months later, American naval forces would conduct an operation that would provide a definitive answer. The setting would be the East China Sea. The target would be the battleship Yamato herself, making a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa. And this time, the Americans would plan their response with careful deliberation rather than desperate improvisation. April 7, 1945. Yamato steamed southwest through the East China Sea, leading a surface force designated the Surface Special Attack Force. The name carried grim significance. This was Ten-Go, a kamikaze mission in everything but name. Yamato and her escorts had been loaded with sufficient fuel only for a one-way journey. Their orders were to reach Okinawa, beach themselves, and fight as stationary shore batteries until destroyed. The mission was suicide by design, a final gesture of defiance with no expectation of success or survival. The context for Ten-Go reflected Japan's desperate strategic situation in early 1945. American forces had landed on Okinawa on April 1st, beginning what would become the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese Army had committed to defending Okinawa with fanatical determination, employing massive kamikaze attacks against American ships. When Emperor Hirohito was briefed on the defensive plans and learned they relied primarily on Army and Air Force units, he reportedly asked, "But what about the Navy? What are they doing to assist in defending Okinawa? Have we no more ships?" The question stung. The Imperial Japanese Navy had once been the terror of the Pacific. Now, in April 1945, it had been reduced to a handful of operational ships. Most of Japan's carriers lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf. The majority of her cruisers had been sunk by submarines or aircraft. Her destroyer force, once numbering over 100 ships, had been decimated in the grinding campaigns of attrition through the Solomons, the Philippines, and the island-hopping advance across the Pacific. Yamato represented one of the few major combatants Japan still possessed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, drafted orders for Yamato's final sortie. The battleship would sortie with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. They would transit south through the East China Sea, penetrate the American fleet around Okinawa, and deliberately beach themselves on the island's western coast. Once grounded, they would serve as massive shore batteries, their big guns supporting the Army's defense until American counterfire destroyed them. No provision was made for return. The crews were on a one-way mission. The Japanese naval staff understood the operation's futility. Yahagi's commanding officer, Captain Tamechi Hara, had survived the entire war and was one of the few Japanese destroyer captains from 1941 still alive. He recognized Ten-Go as a suicide mission with virtually no chance of success. Many of Yamato's crew held similar views. Before departure, the ship put ashore 67 midshipmen who had just reported aboard, though many begged to stay. Older sailors and those who were sick were also sent ashore. The morale aboard the departing ships was described as not being very good, which represented considerable understatement for a crew being sent on a suicide mission. Yamato departed Tokuyama on April 6 at 3 in the afternoon. The force included the destroyers Fuyuzuki, Yukikaze, Kasumi, Isokaze, Hamakaze, Suzutsuki, Asashimo, and Hatsushimo. These ships represented nearly all that remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface combatants. Their departure was noted immediately. American submarines USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback detected the force and reported its course and speed. American reconnaissance aircraft picked up the trail and shadowed the Japanese ships throughout the night. By dawn on April 7th, American naval commanders possessed complete and accurate intelligence regarding Yamato's position, course, speed, and composition of forces. This situation differed fundamentally from Samar. At Samar, American forces had been surprised and forced to improvise. Here, American commanders had time to plan their response carefully. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, initially ordered rear. Admiral Morton Deo to intercept Yamato with a surface force. Deo commanded 6 modern fast battleships, Massachusetts, Indiana, New Jersey, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Missouri, plus 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers. This force possessed overwhelming firepower advantages. The American battleships carried 16-inch guns with modern fire control radar. They could engage Yamato at ranges where her 18-inch guns would struggle to achieve hits. The American cruisers added their 8-inch batteries. The destroyers could coordinate torpedo attacks from multiple directions. But Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, preempted Spruance's surface action. Mitcher's fast carrier task force had demonstrated at Leyte Gulf what carrier aviation could accomplish against even the most heavily armored battleships. Mitcher proposed to strike Yamato with massed carrier aircraft, eliminating any risk to American surface ships. Spruance approved, though he kept Deo's battleships in position as backup in case the airstrikes failed. The battleships would serve as a blocking force, ensuring Yamato could not reach the vulnerable amphibious ships off Okinawa, even if she survived the air attacks. Task Groups 58.1 and 58.3 began launching aircraft at 10 o'clock on the morning of April 7th. Task Group 58.4 launched shortly thereafter. 15 carriers contributed aircraft to the strikes. The total force committed exceeded 300 aircraft Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. 5 carrier air groups became lost in bad weather and were unable to attack, but the remaining forces still numbered nearly 300 aircraft. The scale of the American response reflected lessons learned from the Musashi's sinking 6 months earlier at the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, had absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally sinking. American naval planners understood that Yamato-class battleships could sustain catastrophic damage and continue fighting. The armor protecting Yamato's vital spaces was the thickest ever mounted on a battleship. Her magazines were protected by multiple armored decks and bulkheads. Her machinery spaces included extensive compartmentalization and damage control systems. Sinking such a ship required overwhelming force applied systematically. American carrier doctrine had evolved considerably since 1942. Early war tactics had involved individual squadron attacks with little coordination. By 1945, American carrier air groups conducted carefully orchestrated strikes, with fighters suppressing anti-aircraft fire, dive bombers targeting superstructure and fire control systems, and torpedo bombers concentrating on specific areas of the hull to induce progressive flooding. The attacks on Yamato would employ these evolved tactics. At 11:15, Yamato's radar detected the approaching American aircraft at 44 miles. An observation post on a small Japanese island north of Okinawa radioed that 150 American planes were heading toward the task force, though this report arrived 30 minutes late. 8 Hellcat fighters appeared overhead at 11:30, circling outside anti-aircraft range, spotting for the main attack waves. No Japanese fighters appeared to contest them. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, which maintained control of most surviving Japanese aircraft, could muster no fighters to defend the Navy's last battleship. This absence of air cover would prove fatal. At 12:10, the destroyer Asashimo, which had fallen behind the main force due to engine trouble, radioed that she was under air attack. Her transmissions ceased shortly afterward. Aircraft from the carriers Bunker Hill and San Jacinto had found her and overwhelmed her with torpedoes and bombs. Asashimo went down with all 330 hands. The attack on the straggler served as a grim preview of what awaited the main force. At 12:30, the first American attack wave, nearly 300 aircraft from 7 carriers, arrived over Yamato and her escorts. The initial attacks demonstrated the systematic destruction doctrine American aviators had perfected. Fighters swept in first, strafing anti-aircraft gun positions. The 25mm and 12.7mm guns that provided Yamato's close-in defense suffered heavy casualties. Gun crews were killed or forced to take cover. Fire control directors were damaged. The suppression attacks reduced Yamato's defensive fire significantly before the bombers arrived. Dive bombers followed, targeting Yamato's superstructure. The intent was not to penetrate the main armor belt, which bombs could not breach, but to destroy the ship's ability to control her own defense. Fire control directors, communication systems, radar installations, and secondary armament were systematically targeted. 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb hit Yamato's number 1 turret roof without penetrating, though the impact damaged internal systems. Another bomb struck the port side deck and penetrated 2 decks before exploding above an engine room. The explosion ruptured a steam line, forcing abandonment of that engine room and the adjacent boiler room. Yamato's speed dropped from 27 knots to 22 knots. While dive bombers struck from above, torpedo bombers attacked from both sides simultaneously. This coordinated approach was critical. Yamato's damage control systems could counterflood compartments to correct a list to one side. But if torpedoes struck both port and starboard, counterflooding became impossible. The ship would take on water without being able to maintain level trim. The first wave scored 2 torpedo hits on Yamato's port side during this initial attack. One struck abreast the number 1 turret, the second flooded a hydraulic machinery room. The hydraulic system failure forced Yamato's main turrets to switch to auxiliary hydraulic pumps, reducing their rate of fire. But Yamato remained battle-worthy. Her main battery continued firing her special Type 3 anti-aircraft shells, which burst into clouds of incendiary shrapnel designed to destroy aircraft. The shells proved largely ineffective. American pilots reported them as impressive-looking, but not particularly dangerous. More effective were Yamato's 12.7-centimeter guns, which fired conventional anti-aircraft bursts. The light cruiser Yahagi became the focus of intensive attacks. Smaller and less heavily armored than Yamato, Yahagi represented an easier target. At 12:46, a torpedo hit Yahagi directly in her engine room, killing the entire engineering crew and bringing her to a complete stop. Unable to maneuver, Yahagi absorbed at least 6 more torpedoes and 12 bombs from successive attack waves. The cruiser capsized and sank at 14:05. The destroyer Isokaze attempted to rescue Yahagi's crew but was herself attacked and heavily damaged. The destroyer Hamikaze took a bomb hit aft and then a torpedo that broke her in two. She sank at 12:47 with 140 of her 240 crew lost. Between 13:20 and 14:15, second and third waves of American aircraft struck Yamato. The coordination and concentration of these attacks reflected careful planning. Dive bombers continued targeting superstructure and fire control systems, progressively degrading Yamato's defensive capabilities. But the decisive attacks came from the torpedo bombers. American aviators had learned from the Musashi engagement. The key to sinking a Yamato-Class battleship was progressive flooding that overwhelmed damage control capabilities. This required multiple torpedo hits concentrated in specific areas of the hull. Torpedo bombers attacked from both sides simultaneously, making evasive maneuvers impossible. Yamato's commanding officer, Captain Kosaku Aruga, attempted to turn into the torpedoes to minimize the target area presented to the attacking aircraft. But with torpedoes approaching from multiple directions, no single course could minimize exposure to all attacks. More torpedoes struck. Exact numbers remain disputed, with estimates ranging from 11 to 19 total torpedo hits by the time the attacks ended. What is certain is that Yamato was hit multiple times on both port and starboard sides. The progressive damage proved catastrophic. Flooding in forward compartments dragged Yamato's bow down. The ship began taking water over her main deck. Counter-flooding to correct the list only increased the total amount of water aboard, reducing buoyancy. Power failures disrupted pumping systems. Fires from bomb hits prevented damage control parties from reaching flooded compartments. By 14:02, after being informed that Yamato could no longer steer and was sinking, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito ordered the mission cancelled. He directed the crew to abandon ship and ordered the remaining destroyers to rescue survivors. Ito retired to his flag cabin to go down with his ship. Captain Aruga tied himself to the binnacle rather than abandon his command, but the order to abandon ship came too late for most of Yamato's crew. The ship was already capsizing. Many crew members became trapped below decks as the list exceeded 30 degrees, then 45. At 14:23, as Yamato rolled past 90 degrees, her magazines exploded. The detonation created a mushroom cloud visible 100 miles away. Survivors described being thrown into the air by the blast pressure. Yamato sank rapidly, taking an estimated 3,055 of her 3,332 crew with her. Vice Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga died aboard their ship. Only 276 survivors were recovered by the 4 remaining destroyers. From the first attack at 12:37 to the final explosion at 14:23, Yamato had fought for less than 2 hours. American forces had committed 386 aircraft to the strikes. 10 American planes were shot down. 12 more were damaged but recovered aboard their carriers. American casualties totaled 12 aircrew killed and 8 wounded. In exchange, the Americans had sunk the most powerful battleship ever constructed, along with a light cruiser and 3 destroyers. 3 additional destroyers were damaged. American battle efficiency had reached levels that the Japanese could not match. The contrast between Samar and Tengo illuminates how destroyer torpedo tactics functioned under different circumstances. At Samar, American destroyers achieved success through aggression that exploited Japanese command confusion and created psychological disruption. The Japanese commanders made their critical errors not from American tactical brilliance, but from their own misassessment of the situation. American destroyers created the conditions for those errors through their unexpectedly aggressive attacks, but Japanese command failures ultimately determined the battle's outcome. At Tengo, American forces conducted a methodical destruction operation against a Japanese force that lacked any realistic hope of success. The Japanese knew they were on a suicide mission. American forces possessed complete intelligence regarding Japanese movements and capabilities. No surprise, no confusion, no command errors determined the outcome. Superior American air power, carefully coordinated and overwhelming in its application, destroyed the Japanese force while sustaining minimal losses. The 10 American aircraft lost represented less than 3% of the attacking force, an acceptable loss rate by any standard. The myth of the destroyer's crazy 35-knot torpedo run deserves careful examination. Such tactics worked at Samar because they exploited specific Japanese vulnerabilities, command rigidity, tactical doctrine unsuited for close-range melee actions, and psychological assumptions about American behavior. Against a rational, well-informed opponent with modern fire control systems, such charges would likely result in catastrophic destroyer losses without achieving proportional results. The Americans demonstrated at Tengo that they had no intention of risking destroyers unnecessarily when carrier aircraft could accomplish the mission with minimal risk to surface forces. But the deterrent value of the destroyer-torpedo threat remained significant. Even at Tengo, when American commanders knew that carrier aircraft would almost certainly sink Yamato, they kept 6 modern battleships positioned as a blocking force. The presence of American destroyers in that force would have provided insurance against any possibility of Yamato breaking through the air attacks. American naval doctrine never abandoned the destroyer torpedo as a weapon, but that weapon was integrated into a combined arms approach that used all available assets, air power, surface gunfire, and torpedo attacks in coordinated fashion to achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The legacy of Samar and Tengo shaped destroyer tactics for the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. American destroyers continued to serve as torpedo platforms, but increasingly their value lay in anti-aircraft defense, anti-submarine warfare, and fire support for amphibious operations. The scenarios where destroyers would conduct aggressive torpedo attacks against enemy capital ships became increasingly rare as American naval aviation achieved total dominance. When American destroyers did conduct torpedo attacks in the final months of the war, they did so as part of carefully coordinated operations with overwhelming advantages in intelligence, fire control, and combined arms integration. Japanese survivors of both Samar and Tengo offered perspectives that illuminate what it felt like to face American naval power. Officers from the Japanese cruisers at Samar reported confusion and frustration at being unable to coordinate effective fire while dodging destroyer attacks and airstrikes. They described the psychological impact of American aggressiveness, which contradicted their expectations of cautious American behavior. Some Japanese commanders praised the courage of the American destroyer captains while lamenting their own command failures that allowed inferior forces to achieve such disproportionate results. Survivors from Yamato's final sortie described hopelessness and resignation. They had sailed, knowing they would not return. The appearance of hundreds of American aircraft confirmed what they had already known, that Japan's naval power had been utterly eclipsed by American industrial production and tactical superiority. The systematic destruction of Yamato represented not just the sinking of a ship, but the definitive end of the battleship era, and the final proof that air power now dominated naval warfare. The technical evolution of destroyer torpedo tactics from 1944 to 1945 reflects broader changes in naval warfare. Destroyers, designed in the 1930s as torpedo platforms operating in traditional gun and torpedo fleet actions, found themselves repurposed for anti-aircraft escort duty, anti-submarine patrols, and amphibious fire support. Their torpedoes remained aboard, always ready for the possibility of surface action, but increasingly those weapons served as insurance and deterrent rather than primary armament. The Fletcher-class destroyers that charged the Japanese fleet at Samar were among the last destroyers designed primarily around their torpedo batteries. Post-war destroyer designs would emphasize anti-aircraft missiles, anti-submarine weapons, and surface-to-surface guided weapons. The torpedo would persist, but in a different form, wire-guided, homing torpedoes, designed for anti-submarine warfare rather than anti-ship attacks. The era of massed destroyer torpedo attacks against enemy battle lines would not recur. The specific tactical conditions that made such attacks effective: limited fire control technology, lack of radar, inadequate air cover had been superseded by technological advances that made such attacks suicidal without compensating tactical advantages. The destroyer crews who charged enemy battleships at Samar and those who might have done so at Tengo if called upon shared certain characteristics. They understood their ship's vulnerabilities and the overwhelming firepower advantages possessed by enemy capital ships. They recognized that destroyer attacks against battleships represented desperate tactics with high casualty expectations. Yet, when ordered to attack, they executed those orders with skill and determination that achieved results far beyond what their ship's specifications suggested possible. That combination of technical competence, tactical flexibility, and sheer courage defined American destroyer operations throughout the Pacific War. The question implicit in the title, why destroyer crews started crazy 35-knot torpedo runs against Yamato-Class battleships, has a complex answer. They conducted such attacks because tactical circumstances sometimes demanded desperate measures. They succeeded at Samar because they exploited specific enemy vulnerabilities and because Japanese commanders made critical errors. They would have conducted similar attacks at Tengo if circumstances required, though American commanders wisely chose to employ carrier aviation instead. The craziness of such tactics was always contextual, dependent on specific circumstances and the alternatives available. The broader lesson extends beyond specific tactical decisions to fundamental principles of naval warfare. Superior intelligence provides decisive advantages. Careful coordination of multiple weapon systems achieves results that individual systems cannot accomplish alone. Aggressive action can disrupt enemy plans and create opportunities, but such aggression must be grounded in realistic assessment of capabilities and limitations. Most importantly, material superiority and technological advantages will eventually overwhelm courage and determination, no matter how extraordinary that courage may be. By April 1945, American naval superiority had become so overwhelming that Japanese forces could not effectively contest American operations. Yamato's final sortie represented not a realistic military operation, but a symbolic gesture of defiance, an acknowledgement that Japan's naval power had been comprehensively defeated. The systematic destruction of that force by American carrier aviation demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted since 1941. Japanese destroyers that once terrorized Allied forces with their long-lance torpedoes now served primarily as rescue vessels, salvaging survivors from battleships and cruisers systematically destroyed by American air power. The human cost of these operations deserves acknowledgement. American sailors who died at Samar, over 1,000 of them, gave their lives protecting a vital strategic objective. Japanese sailors who died at Tengo, over 3,000 aboard Yamato alone, died in a mission that their own commanders knew was futile. Both groups demonstrated courage and professional competence. The fact that American forces ultimately prevailed reflected industrial capacity, technological superiority, and strategic decisions made years earlier, not any inherent superiority in individual courage or skill among the combatants. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.